Ja, herzlich willkommen, liebe Freunde und Mitglieder der Atlas Initiative. Ich begrüße Sie herzlich zu dem Video heute, ein absolutes Novum. Wir melden uns heute zurück mit Professor William Toel. Er hat aber darum gebeten, ihn nicht Professor zu nennen, weil er bald keine Professur mehr hat. Deswegen nur Mr. Toel, herzlich willkommen in die Vereinigten Staaten. Inspiriert hat uns ein Interview, das er eigentümlich frei und Uta Ogilvy gegeben hat. Das hat uns in gewisser Weise begeistert und er sprach in diesem Interview von dem Modell der Deutschen. Und da fiel uns direkt bei mir die Kaiserzeit ein vor 1914, also die Zeit von 1871 bis 1914. Und wir hatten dort Staatsquoten von 15% und heute, ja, mit den Covid Economics haben wir sicherlich Staatsquoten von weit über 50% und sind da schon im Bereich der Lenkungswirtschaft. Vorher hatten wir nach dem Krieg 30% und jetzt zuletzt vor Covid 45%. Ja, Mr. Toel, herzlich willkommen. Wie beurteilen Sie die Zeit vor 1914 und was sollten wir Deutschen daraus lernen und wie bekommen wir unsere Wirtschaft wieder auf marktwirtschaftliches Niveau und die Staatsquoten auf ein Normalmaß?
Well, thank you, Benny. I'll see if I can answer your questions. I worked quite a bit in the last 2 or 3 days to come up with pages of answers using von Hayek and von Mises and Karl Popper and Schumpeter and changes in economic theory. And when I woke up this morning, I realized that all of central bank policy is not what life is all about. So I decided that the economic part makes me look good, but doesn't do anything for the people who I am deeply in love with. And it's an intimate and passionate love, and that is for the German people. So I've decided here this morning to take a different tact and maybe to speak directly to them and at the same time try to answer your questions. Now, I'm going to start out by reading something, so forgive me for looking down, but I need to read something from Wilhelm Röpke, who was, of course, associated with the Austrian school. But I think that his words are very relevant to the first question that you've asked me. So if I can have your permission, I'm going to read something from him. Röpke says that the conviction that true creative power can prosper only in liberty and not in the graveyard silence of proscribed speech, and that without this intellectual freedom and individual freedom, society must wither, he says. This is important to our discussion. That man has a right to protection against arbitrary power and the abuse of power, that the crushing of every divergence of opinion and any individual cast of mind must eventually lead to a boredom, a tedium, in which the nation's intellectual life is stifled, he says. And it lacks the happiness of laughter. It lacks every sign of humor and the spice of life. So what is left? Well, let me share with you what is left. When I first came to Germany and spent time in 1977, I was so impressed with the fact that young girls, 11 and 12 and 13 years old, could be walking on the streets, walking in the parks at 10, 11 o'clock at night, and they were free and they were safe, and their parents knew they were safe. So there was a laughter and there was a giggling that you heard, and girls were arm in arm, and there was no fear on the streets in Germany in 1977. But the laughter has stopped, and that troubles me deeply. The parks and streets are not safe anymore. What's left is what Ropke told us what was left, what would be left, and that is a sense of humor has been banned, and we have life being lived at a lower level. What we have is the brutish presence of police who are horribly overdressed by the command of the government. Well, they look like Darth Vader in the streets. They're frightening. They're in protection suits that are completely unneeded for the situation. Now, these police are men and women who I have met hundreds of them. I have talked to hundreds of them as I walked all through Eastern Germany. These are brave young Germans who have devoted their lives to caring for their neighbors. These are good people. I've met them. I know many of them. I've had long conversations with them, often in dangerous situations. But many of these people don't agree with the level of overkill. They don't agree with the intimidation factor that they are a part of. And they are forced to project an intimidating presence. Here's a picture I'm going to hold up. I was just in Berlin. Can you see that, Benny? That's the Berlin Zeitung. That is 5 large policemen with armored vests on, approaching one young girl like I used to see in 1977, laughing and giggling. Her mask was on crooked, and this young man is writing her a ticket. There's 5 of them. Benny, when I came to Cologne to talk with Jutta and Michael, I got off the train. We had been on the train for 4 or 5 hours. We were anxious to get off the train and get on with our business. There were 5 policemen standing at the foot of the train writing tickets because people were standing too close to each other. Benny, how do you get off a train and still keep social distancing? You don't. I'm afraid that we have lost all common sense in Germany, and this, what we're seeing on the street, is insane. Spraying cold water on children and people legitimately standing in the street, which could cause illness. That's not right, and everyone in the country knows it's not right. We have fear now on top of confusion. I read to you one more time from Ropke. The welfare state's compulsory aid paralyzes people, he says. The willingness to take care of their own needs and their own burdens is weakened. The ability to do so, while on the other hand, the self-limitation of self-provision, individuality, it makes people more and more dependent upon a government. It is a compulsory public aid system that is meant to make people dependent upon it. Germans are no longer free. He goes on, and by the way, that is exactly the intent of what is happening. Ropke goes on to say, in spite of its alluring name, we always give things alluring names. The welfare state stands and falls by compulsion. It is compulsion imposed upon us with the state's power to punish noncompliance Ropke says, once this is clear, it is equally clear that the welfare state, the government trying to take care of everyone, he says, is evil in the same way as every restriction on freedom is equal. Now, I don't want to add to the confusion, and I don't want to add to the fear. But you have asked me to look into the economics of this. I've been teaching international economics for 25 years, and including the last semester. And we're at a stage right now where I think Ropke is more of the answer than any of our modern day economists. See, well, there's not much difference between Ropke and von Mises or Hayek, but there is a difference. Because Ropke was talking to a purely German soul. And at the end, I want to come back to that. Now, by the way, this is a copy, one of the original copies of Ropke's book, Humane Economy. I'm not pressing Ropke forward, but this book is a treasure, and I've had it for a long time, and there's hardly a word in here that I have not underlined. And every semester, I bring it up. But none of my students have ever heard of him before. Now, directly to your question. We talk about the Golden Zeit in 1914 and before World War I. This was we think globalization is something that's all new. We have a new generation of people, and we say globalization. Well, that's like the internet. That belongs to us. Globalization was in full swing between 1899 and the beginning of World War II in 1914. It was a golden era in which people prospered from an interconnectedness that had never been there before. Everything was new. Things were fresh. People were making money. People were meeting each other. Travel across the ocean all of a sudden became an easy way. It was a golden period of time. But the problem was it burned too bright, and it made a concentration of power where too few people were able to take advantage of it, and we grew up a whole class of extremely rich people who had a monopoly or an oligopoly. We also had mercantilism that all of a sudden rose up as people took advantage. And there were great imbalances and trade imbalances that were certain to lead to conflict. And of course, they did lead to conflict. It's economics that is the core behind war. It's not politics that is the core behind war. It is bad economics. And that's what happened, and that's what led to the explosion. World War I, a short period. World War II, with many of those problems unsolved. Now, we're not going to get back to the 15% rate that you've talked about, but we could get back to a reasonable 30% rate, and where we are today at over 50%, it certainly must lead to inflationary pressures in the short term, unless we mask them and pretend that they're not there. We just refuse to talk about them. Okay? Contingent liabilities are a problem in Germany today. Angela Merkel has made promises. She has made commitments, some of which the German people know about, but most of which they don't know anything about. And there's contingent liabilities, promises behind the scene of what will happen, of guarantees. The German people know nothing about this. They're not involved in the discussion at all. As a matter of fact, Angela Merkel says they can't be trusted to be involved in their future. We have to do what's good for them because they don't know what's good for them. Well, she couldn't be more wrong. Now, the initial golden promises that came up to 1914 of globalization ended up in a race to the bottom. And everyone knew that. And we had crisis. I'm in my 75th year, and we've had 8 crises, all because of speed. We're moving too fast. We're in a race to the bottom, and nobody is reflecting. Nobody is looking at the consequences or the unintended consequences. So we keep bumbling along. Each crisis gets more serious than the one before. In 1987, I said, for the sake of efficiency, human dignity must suffer. And that's exactly what's happened. If we can't measure it, Benny, then we don't even consider it. But see, these people are operating on a playing field that doesn't exist in real life. In real life, there's real people and human dignity and self-respect and caring for one another. These are things that can't be quantified, so we ignore them. They're not even in our equations. We're coming up with so-called right answers, but to the wrong questions. You know, we've came to the point where we're actually worshiping at the throne of kings. That's the shortcut. We're going to borrow money and throw it at every problem. Borrow money and throw it at every problem. Who cares about discipline? Well, Cain certainly didn't care about discipline himself. You know, I look at Marcus Krall's 5 pillars, where he talks about family and property and individuality and religion and culture. Well, Ropke talks about all these with the same kind of passion. Okay. Marcus Krall has best-selling books, and he has a loyal following for good reason. But to take the easy way, to borrow money and throw it at every problem, knowing that it's not going to work, well, this makes Marcus Krall's work take a back seat. It doesn't belong in a back seat. Now, the concentration in both government and mega corporations, huge corporations today, is destroying and has destroyed family businesses. Here in America, we have wiped out hundreds of thousands of family businesses under the guise of COVID. But it's what we wanted to do all along. We want to make people more and more dependent upon the government. The problem is work ethic, an underpinning of civil values, things that are natural to the family themselves are also being wiped out. And that's very bad for society. Now, to turn this around and to finish this first question, we've got to have leaders in Germany, regardless of their party, who will put German families first and put the emphasis on individual responsibility. This is what creates the atmosphere for entrepreneurs and for owner-run type businesses. German families have no real champions today. There is no one who makes them a first priority, and they know it. Benny, that's the end of question number 1.
Ja, vielen Dank für die ausführliche Beantwortung der Frage. Die zweite Frage setzen wir auch wieder an bei der Kaiserzeit, und zwar bei einem Detail, was vielfach vergessen wird, nämlich, dass der Kaiser sehr, sehr viel und seine damalige Administration in Forschung und Entwicklung investiert hat. Also wir hatten nie wieder danach so viele Forscher aus Deutschland, die den Nobelpreis bekamen beispielsweise. Wir sind der Ansicht, dass Wissen auch deutlich wichtiger ist als natürliche Ressourcen. Und Wissen ist unbegrenzt. Das ist eine sehr, sehr wichtige Aussage, denke ich. Sind Sie auch der Ansicht, dass Forschung und Entwicklung sehr, sehr wichtig wäre, um Deutschland wieder als Land der Ideen zu platzieren und auch als, ja, zu alter Stärke zurückzuführen als Zugpferd Europas?
Well, Benny, it was Schumpeter who taught us that consistent profit only comes from innovation, but it has to be continual innovation. It has to be an innovation that creates a perpetual healthy economy. It capitalizes on German things such as a motivation for excellence, technological progress that is necessary for for profit in the future has to come from a newness of ideas, a newness of knowledge, of methods, of organizations, of institutions and procedures that encourage growth. And the Germans are the experts in this area when they are Germans and when they are free to do their thing, what they do naturally. The Germans can have a razor edge in every one of these areas that I have just mentioned, and they should have. Creativity, as Ropke says, comes when you feel free. My students, always 60% of the students in my classes are afraid to speak in class because they don't know who's listening. Who will misinterpret what I said? Who will twist it around and make it something different and embarrass me? Political correctness has silenced us. But Ropke tells us that we must have a freedom to have opinions, a freedom of speech. All scientific endeavor that is real and produces results comes out of the freedom of ideas and opinions and even divergent opinions. That's where it comes from. And today in Germany, there is a dangerous trend of suppression under a whole variety of guises. A blog I wrote was heavily criticized because I said that history in the future may judge the Merkel-Zeit, her 14 years plus, as even more restrictive on free speech and free thought than the 12 years and 6 months of the Hitler-Zeit did. People said, you can't say that. That's impossible. But what if history judges it that way 50 years from now? We don't know that. Now, in exchange for jobs and security, this is where we are. The German says, fine, I'm born, I'll be taken care of, I know what my life's going to be. I'm going to have a lifetime job. I'm going to have a safety net. I'm going to have security. But life is far more than that. And every German family knows it. Merkel is extremely efficient and effective at keeping questions to a minimum and everyone marching in the same direction, including the press. You got 6 or 7 wonderful newspapers, but it's like reading one newspaper. That's not right. And because of this open pressure to conform, aided by political correctness and the cancel culture, which has been in Germany before it even came to America, there is a strong tendency for people to self-censure. They're afraid of their own ideas. We have put restrictions on what can be discussed and what can be investigated. You have 2 or 3 investigative journalist teams in Germany who are well funded. Have you noticed, Benny, that they don't investigate the German government? They investigate the Russians, they investigate these people, they investigate those people, but not their people. They stay away from it. Now, no matter how much money is allocated to research and development, without freedom of speech and thought, creativity will not take place. Today, the inner richness of life in Germany is stilted. Controls are simply too tight. Too many German women have an anxiety, an anxiousness around and in their eyes. Look at it, you'll see what I'm talking about. And too many German men are weak. I don't know how else to say it. They're weak. The reason Germany no longer claims a lion's share of the Nobel and other prestigious innovation prizes is also stemming from the fact that the greatest sin in Germany is to like Germans. It creates instant suspicion in you. There's no unity. It's a reactionary society, constantly on its back foot, purposely made small and defensive. And it's this small mentality that keeps Germans from striving to be noticed and receiving the due recognition for their work. In this small mentality, Germany is robbing the world of the immense assets of Germanness itself. And I estimate, after 30 years of being among you, I estimate that in infrastructure and in individual application, Germany is running 25 to 30% below its potential. This is a tragic and very real loss for those around the world, well, in the most need. Now, inadvertently, and don't get me wrong, I love Germans. Inadvertently, this is a form of selfishness that has to come to an end. That's all I have to say on question 2, sir.
Okay, vielen Dank. Sie sprachen in dem Interview mit Uta auch über ihre Sorge über eine nahende Inflation in Europa, in Deutschland und die Konfusion, die dann innerhalb der Bevölkerung entsteht und jetzt schon vorhanden ist letzten Endes. Wir teilen Ihre Ansicht, dass wir ein Szenario der Inflation als sehr wahrscheinlich erachten. Sie sprachen auch, oder wir sprachen vorhin über die Kaiserzeit und über die goldene Zeit mit einer teilgedeckten Golddeckung zumindest. Wie ist Ihre Meinung oder was wäre für Sie das beste Geldsystem? Würden Sie auch meinen, dass ein Währungswettbewerb eine passende Alternative wäre, damit die Menschen ihr bestes Geld auswählen könnten und dass sich das beste Geld durchsetzt, dass also ein Währungswettbewerb herrscht und nicht ein Zwangsmonopol, wie wir es heute vorfinden, leider?
Okay, I got you. The inflation that is coming and the fact that the nation will not be prepared for it is most likely a planned event. It fits the modus operandi, the fingerprints of the current government, getting what it wants, controlling a larger and larger share of the nation's wealth, of families' wealth, without ever including the parliament, the regional parliaments, or the people themselves. They're not even consulted. That's the fingerprints of the current government. Now, this is a form of smugness, Benny, that grows when you have no real competition. The last election in Germany was a well-controlled rubber stamp, and everyone knows it. There was no real debate taking place. These were pre-approved discussions as a way to introduce her back in to another 4 to 5 years. This kind of smugness is what keeps you from engaging with your people. Now, the inflation I'm speaking of comes in many guises, and I've tried to outline that on my website with at least 8 or 9 or 10 of the ones that are already there. And if you look around, you'll see them. And you say, oh my, I didn't know that was inflation. Okay? Remember, inflation widens the gap and exposes the gap between the many victims and the very few who will take advantage of it. That's an important point. Now, Germany's golden age corresponded with the golden age of many other countries. It was bolstered by the fact that currencies were thought to be secure. That's what caused it. That's what allowed it to come about. Now, at the most primal level, today you have nothing but printed, colored pieces of paper that require a trusting population, but you haven't given them any reason to trust. The rapid move to electronic currencies takes us further away from where people around their dinner table in their homes can understand what the value of money is, let alone who controls the money. Wars destroy even partially backed currencies. Our war in Vietnam killed off the gold standard, and now all of us are on thin ice. The Bundesbank was the most respected central bank in the entire world, and the Deutschmark was the underpinning to the world's reserve currency. Everyone kept a Deutschmark and a certain percentage. That was the security blanket. Now, German families understood that their retirement and their quality of life was in good hands. The decisions resonated to German families because they were German decisions. There was a fine balance between fiscal policy and between monetary policy. And when you trust these decisions to a global elite somewhere else, well, that leads to an erosion of trust in any and all currencies. Now, the idea that German families today must guarantee, even as a contingent liability, the unwise debts of other European countries, well, that's a wrong concept. It is unfair, and it belies common sense. No one assumes any responsibility when there is a gigantic fog of the mass. Only confusion remains, and that's exactly where we are today. Every debt crisis we have had has been, we have said, these corporations, these people are too big to fail. So they get all the profits when there are profits, but the middle class in Germany and the middle working class in America has to pay for all their mistakes. It is sacred to capitalism that there is a risk of loss built in for those who are reckless. We have erased that entirely. That's also at the core of the crisis that we're seeing. Now, it is only a return to national accountability where German decisions, both good and bad, have direct and understandable consequences for German citizens. That will restore the trust in a sustainable currency. Ropke's humane economy is about as close as you can at. You ask me, what is the best monetary system? What's the best system we can have? Well, Ropke's humane economy is about as close to a monetary and economic systems that Germans could have. Germans are not natural capitalists. They are wonderful, intelligent, balanced people when they are free to be themselves. And I'm afraid that today there can be no return to the golden age because Germans are living someone else's life to someone else's benefit. And it makes me deeply sad to see someone I love, the German people, living a life well below what could be. That's that question.
Ja, herzlichen Dank für die Frage, beziehungsweise für die Beantwortung der Frage. Wir kommen jetzt sind jetzt mit dem ersten Teil zu Ende und sprechen beim nächsten Mal weiter. Nächste Woche geht es weiter mit dem Interview mit Mr. Toel und da sprechen wir dann nochmal über Leistungssteuern, über die Staatsquoten, über die EU, über die Klimadiskussion und auch über Corona. Erstmal herzlichen Dank in die Vereinigten Staaten. Herzlichen Dank für Ihre Zeit. Und herzlichen Dank auch an die Zuschauer. Bleiben Sie uns treu, bleiben Sie uns wohlgesonnen. Teilen Sie das Video, geben Sie dem Video einen Daumen nach oben und ja, werden Sie auch Mitglied bei der Atlas Initiative, dass Sie uns unterstützen in den Aktivitäten, dass wir hier weitermachen können und auch vorankommen. Der Link ist wie immer unter dem Video. Wir danken Ihnen für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit und bis zum nächsten Mal. Nächste Woche Freitag, wie gesagt, nächste Woche Dienstag das nächste Video mit Mr. Toel. Wir danken Ihnen.